What's up, guys? So today we have Alex Bromley on the podcast. We're going to split this one up. Part one on my channel here, Brains and Gains Podcast. Part two on Alex's channel. Definitely check his channel out for other great videos related to Strongman, lifting in general. A lot of great content there. We're going to talk about Strongman, performance-enhancing drug use in both Strongman and bodybuilding, how that may differ. A lot of really great topics here, so I hope you guys enjoy. All right, everybody. So today on the podcast, we have Alex Bromley. How we doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. So as with every episode, we're going to start this with a charity donation. And today we are sticking with St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. Obviously, that's one I've mentioned on the channel. That and Operation Smile are the two that I mentioned the most. And for anybody who wants to donate, we'll put a link down below. And yeah, it's just a really great organization. So Alex, we connected through Steve Shaw. And we have, I think, some other mutual connections. You mentioned Pete Rubish as well. It's funny, like the space it's very tight knit, right? Like if you find somebody who's really into fitness and lifting and everything, you kind of have like that immediate bond. But at the same time, it's so huge in that, I'll find somebody has like some TikTok with 1 million followers. I've never heard of them, right? Or somebody said to me one time they didn't know who Lane Norton was. And like that was somebody who I saw early. So I was like, how do you not know who Lane Norton is? And it's interesting. Like some people, it's like you find out people know each other, but then there's these huge followings that you've never even heard of.
Yeah, it's like everything's so much closer these days, but it's also so far away because you can connect very easily with people that you could never be directly influenced by just a few years ago. And I mean, I've benefited from that greatly. You were telling me about some of the conversations you've had. So in that way, it's a great time to be alive. But, we could talk about the algorithm and the nature of social media. It does a good job of finding people in the right space and like bubbling them together. So we all end the term I heard recently that I really like is we're all bubble people. We're all in our own bubbles. And we get our little center and our little orbiters, and then everybody kind of interacts slightly. But yeah, there's like niches within niches, and there's people I found that have, like you said, millions of subs that I've never heard of. And I'm like, how has this never come on my radar?
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually heard about you because I was watching. So I've been dealing with some back issues and I was kind of going down that whole rabbit hole. And I actually saw some conversation, the book Gift of Injury with Stu McGill and Brian Carroll. And I was just kind of going down the YouTube rabbit hole of like Stu versus barbell medicine, because there's some disputes there as to the causes and how to treat it and whatnot. And I was reading the comment section because I often like to read the comment sections because one, if something's like, let's just say if there's just advice, if something's totally BS, you can see it kind of called out in the comment section if it's an area you're not as familiar with. But also I think there's a community to it, like I don't know if you ever on the bodybuilding forums, but I was big on them. And there was a whole community there versus Facebook and Instagram. Things get lost very quickly. You can't really search old topics. So I find with YouTube, there's a lot of trolling and memes, but also kind of a community in some of the comment sections. So I was reading through and I saw your responses. And the video I was talking about where you had Brian Carroll and everything.
Yeah, I do.
And I think that was only maybe a year or two ago, something like that. But in any case, I was reading your responses and I was like, this guy is like, just the way you spoke, I was like, these are intelligent responses. They're not just like trolling. Like it was just the way you were talking. I was like, okay, this guy is pretty smart. And I started watching some more of your stuff. And I like the way that you handled even people who were kind of coming at you a little bit negatively. You handled it with tact. And I was like, okay, like, it was a sensible way to go about it. So I guess that's already kind of a big broad topic, but just YouTube comments, is it something that you regulate a lot? Or you try to interact with people?
Well, firstly, I'm glad you found those comments because it's a running joke I'll make occasionally. Like part of my self-improvement plan is learning how to stay the hell out of the comments.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. There is a community sense in there, and there's a lot of people that pop up that will continuously comment, and you'll get little chains, and just every now and then we'll get chain discussions, which I think have the potential to be the most valuable, but they don't pop up very often because people don't often reference back. It's not really designed for that.
No.
The way that, maybe like a long Twitter chain might be, or like big Reddit posts where you're kind of in this one confined space. People click off a video, they forget about it. But there's positives to it, but it can be kind of a mess because there are a lot of people that are either trolling, they're there, and I don't like to focus on that too much. It's not like everybody that's posted a negative comment's a troll,
Sure.
but there are people that, it's the keyboard warrior trope, people that are very overconfident with what they have to say. And it's not even people misrepresenting the topic or speaking incorrectly, or not really being wise to what's going on with the arguments they're making. I mean, a lot of it is people have the confidence to present their idea in like the shittiest way possible. And it makes it hard to engage. So I went through an arc because early on I was trying to be very charitable and I got almost exclusively good feedback. But as you grow, you pull in a little bit more of the riffraff or people that just don't like what you're selling. And you get a lot more of that as time goes on. So I've had to like change my policy recently because it became such a time suck and a lot of the discussions really weren't productive. I might have lost it on a few threads, and I try to make a rule of not deleting my own comments. It's like when I misbehave, it's like the evidence stays there. That's my punishment for all of that. But I've tried to go into different platforms. Like I did have a forum. I was on the Miranda Muscle forum back in the day when that was on, and that was very strongman specific, and it was great because everybody knew each other. But you're right, the mechanics are a little bit different, so engagement is as well. And I've had some good results on Facebook. I've had some good results. Reddit to a degree. I've had my issues with Redditors, but yeah, no, that it can be a very productive space. I do like to engage with people when it can be meaningful, and it's really hard to get that when you're not in person.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely very different online versus in person. And I have a little more to say on it, but let's back up a little bit and actually give your background. Because I saw some of your lifting videos. I know you're very strong, and you just mentioned the strongman stuff. So what is your background in this space?
So I started training when I was 12. I'm 36 now. And I've been very consistent. I mean, I love to train. And so that's something that's always been a thread no matter what. If I'm injured, if I'm sick, training still happens. I started training when I was young because I was an overweight kid, basically not very happy with my physique, not a lot of self-esteem, not a lot of friends. Jumped into playing football because that just seemed like the easiest way to check all those boxes. And that's one of the best things I ever did. No idea where that inspiration came from, but that was one of the most life-changing things I ever did. And then from there, I got through high school and realized that I was still a crappy athlete, but I liked lifting, and I was looking for avenues to keep lifting. I did graduate a bit young. I started school pretty early. So I was out of high school. I was 16, and I was just looking for competitive avenues. The internet was very different back then. You're talking about 2003, 2004, and YouTube didn't exist. Instagram didn't exist. I don't even think Facebook was around. Anyways, very, very hard to find anything. So it's funny, as pervasive as powerlifting and strength sports are now. I mean, back then I was looking for an avenue, and I type into the early iterations of the search engines and couldn't find anything. And eventually I stumbled across Strongman. So I've been doing Strongman since I was 19. That was my first contest. And I've been in over 50 shows. Wow. I haven't gotten a pro card. There's one Fed that gives a pro card. So that's like the feather in my cap that I'm still kind of chasing. But there's a lot of other federations that offer contests very high level. So I've been to Worlds, I've been to America's Strongest Man, I've been to Clash on the Coast, is one of the bigger ones for the middleweights. And I've done pretty well against some of the best guys. I would say I'm at the bottom of the barrel of the upper echelon of strongman competitors.
Okay.
But I'm in the middleweights. So and that's my experience. And then just general coaching and training as a livelihood since I was probably 20 or so.
So that's what you do full time. I mean, you probably have some YouTube income, but otherwise it's basically fully training people.
Now it's fully YouTube. Actually, I owned a gym in California for about 6 years, powerlifting and strongman gym. And I did a lot of one-on-one work there, and got to work with a lot of really good athletes. And before that, I had worked at corporate gyms. I trained privately. So a wide array of clients, which is kind of important in this field, because everything that you look at with programming or training is always this what if this person is X, Y, or Z, psychologically, physically, medically. So having that insight, I think, helped YouTube with reaching a wider audience, addressing issues that people might run into. But right now it's the only reason we were able to move is I have a remote income. So the social media thing was a good move. That's paid off greatly.
But are you still training clients remotely, or it's just YouTube income essentially?
No, I do train clients. I've limited my stable of clients pretty drastically.
Gotcha.
I have 10 right now.
Wow.
And I was talking to somebody recently about this. There's a lot of people in my field that have over 100,
Yeah.
and God help me, I don't know how they balance it.
Yeah.
Doing it well with 10 people is difficult if you want to do it well, and many times impossible. There's a lot of things you can't do remotely. So I had to limit it, partially because I don't get the same satisfaction as working with people in person, and partially because I have other things that just require so much time.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I have an entire career and practice and all that stuff. So I train like probably similar 5 to 10 people at a time. And otherwise, I have a few people who I trust. So I just say, I think it would be better to just see these other people because one, it becomes not enjoyable to me if it's too many people. But then two, if I'm spread too thin, I just think it's not going to be comprehensive coaching, which is what I like to usually be able to provide.
Absolutely. And you do your training in person or remotely?
Also remotely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a different animal. It's like it's great that you can help, it's great that exists for people and they're not spinning their wheels listening to whatever the idiots at 24-hour fitness tell them, when
Mm,
you're planning to train. Like, you can actually get people that have been around the block. So that's a great thing. But yeah, so many of the issues are just they're untreatable from across the country. So it's a bit of good and it's a bit of bad.
Can you touch on that a little bit? What issues you find are amenable to online coaching versus those that aren't?
The obvious one's technical stuff, and you can do all of the form check videos you want, but then again, that takes time. You have to trust them to actually film their sets. And then there's part of me that doesn't want people focused on camera work when they're trying to lift, even though I guess everybody does that anyways. But then you have to assume that they're even sending you the right footage. They might send you their best set. They might send you the one that looked the cleanest. So there's a lot of little things. I mean, I would make people uncomfortable in person because I would be constantly circling around. It was like I was like eyeballing a new car that I was about to buy. I'd be like hovering around people. They'd be
Yeah.
mid lift on like a max upper lift. I'm like walking around their back. They can see me out of the peripheral, but I'm constantly looking at how the chain moves. And it's really hard to do that based on, they're stationary, how they set up the camera. You get that one perspective. So that's probably the hardest one. And then aside from just diagnosing things, being in person and being able to repeat the same cue the 35 times that they need to hear it before it starts to click, that's also another thing. Because I do everything on like a Google Drive sheet, and then I leave notes and I can see their videos, they can leave links, and it's great. There's communication. But some of the issues, it's like I don't have a sexy fix for it. It's you're going to put this technical cap on yourself, and when things start to falter, that's where it's over. And if you do more work, you do it at that threshold. And that's probably one of the most straightforward ways to fix a lot of issues. And it's impossible to have people follow through on that. You can't tell clients to hold themselves to a technical cap for the most part. So that's one. And then there's just other things with consistency, interpretation, communication of what you wrote. A lot of things are easier to explain in person. If you're having a face-to-face conversation, if you're watching them lift, you can see how they interpret the words that you're saying to them. I had a talk recently, another podcast I was on, we went just so in depth about percentage versus RPE for that reason. It's not that the concept doesn't work. It works very well. It's just how you mold each individual into that construct makes it tricky unless you know everything about how that person interprets it. And that makes it very hard to apply to a lot of people. So there's no right answer when you're trying to remotely give an explanation of what the sets should look like. It's a lot of it is like, well, let's start here, and then we'll
Yeah.
kind of
Sure.
as we go along.
So just for people's reference, you mentioned you keep at middle weight. So what's like height, weight, and strongman's a little harder for some of the people to relate to, but like let's say big three lifts.
Sure. So I'm 5'10". Well, that my driver's license says I'm 5'10". I'm sticking to that. I'm probably 5'9" after so many years of heavy yoke walks. But I walk right now, I'm about 250, which is still way too fat for me. At my biggest, and when I was in competition mode, taking all the supplements, my biggest as a middleweight, I was around 270 when I would
Wow.
blow. I got up to 280, but I haven't cut from 280 before. But I'd be between 260 and 270, and a couple of weeks of dieting followed by a vicious water cut, and that's how I'd end up at 231. But even then, my body fat's pretty high. Everybody puts in Instagram nowadays, the world's strongest, whatever, if they're a strongman competitor, world's strongest dentist, world's strongest dog groomer. And it started out kind of funny, kind of tongue in cheek, but then you'll see people put things in where it's like, oh, this guy really thinks he's like the world's strongest, master's accountant or whatever. I am by far, I'm the world's fattest middleweight, because the guys,
Yeah.
if you look at the podium, you can look at any contest I've done. Like I took 5th at Worlds. If you look at the top 20 that year, it's which one doesn't belong. It's a bunch of guys with 6-packs and then me, who
That's
have
funny.
to do this weight cut because I'm 25 pounds too heavy. Anyways, so that's a running joke. But I do like to eat. I have a frame that accommodates that, and I've been able to get away with it. If I was really, really serious, I would have no excuse not to go clean that up, give myself a little more room. But anyways, the big three, it's changed a lot. When I was 19, so you're talking 2006, if you were a 231 competitor and you had if you had like a 650 deadlift, it'd be like, give that man a pro card. You needed a 650 deadlift, a 300-pound log, and if you could load like a 360 stone, like you were made in the shade. Now the numbers are so skewed. On the one hand, people are a lot stronger now because there's a bigger talent pool, but on the other hand, skill specialization has diverged. There's a lot of examples of guys who are very, very good at the events who aren't necessarily statically the strongest. So in the middle where those meet, that's where you get the freaks. So the best guy right now is Nick Camby, who just went up to the heavyweights. So you're looking at a guy that weighs about what I do. He's just, dense, no fat on him. But he had right around an 800-pound deadlift. He had all the overhead records, so he could like split jerk 450, and he could actually push press 400 for reps. Very, very strong overhead. And he could move and run with anything. But there's a lot of guys I can point to as middleweights that have 850 deadlifts, 900 deadlifts. There's a lot of guys I can point to that are well into the 4s on the overhead. Squatting is kind of a mixed bag. There's a lot of good squatters, but it doesn't get contested so often. I maintain squatting is very important for the sport. Some people get by deadlifting 3 times a week and never doing a squat. You can't squat their way out of a paper bag. So that one's a little more all over the place. I think strongman squatting is a little leaves a little something to be desired, but that's kind of a ballpark of what you could expect at the highest levels.
Yeah. And sorry, you said your 3 were what? Did you say yours already?
Oh, my big 3.
Yeah.
So my best numbers, I've never hit a true deadlift max. I did a 725 for 5.
Okay.
That was strapped in, bounced. Realistically, my best pull was probably mid 7s, I would say. I've done a 410 log. So that's the heaviest overhead press I've done. So my best squat, I want to say, is like a 675. It was done so many years ago. So ballpark, that's where I was, and pretty well rounded on the events. That actually saved my ass more than anything, is I've just been doing the events longer than everybody else.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say like the squat was a long time ago. So you're probably still improving the technique aspect if you're still competitive, but maybe just not focusing so much on like increasing your 1 rep max squat, for example.
My situation's a little specific because I had some horrible hip pain that plagued me for a couple of years, and I didn't know what to attribute that to, but I squatted stubbornly for a lot of years when I probably shouldn't have. But it was just hip pain and inflammation. So I'd run it along for a couple of months, take time off, run it along for a couple of months. That's my best lift, I would say, mechanically. For those who haven't seen me like in person, I'm built like a dachshund. So I'm very torso, very long, very short arms, very short legs. So it's really good for squatting and pressing, not so much for deadlifting.
Right.
So squatting's always been very comfortable, but that's been the lift that I've probably been like the most injured on or whatever. But from your standpoint, what you said as far as skill acquisition, that's a big part of it, because it's one of those things. It's like, well, you're extending at the ankle, knee, and hip under a load. Most of strongman is that. It should carry over pretty well. So why do people not do it? Some of it's programming. I think there's so many things to do where people will start with squatting, and then as they get more specific, closer to a peak, it's one of the first things to get dropped because you have so many things you have to train. And then others is like the sport selects for really good deadlifters. So mechanically, you might get guys that are very awkward in a squat and don't see the need to get around it. So there's some different things at play in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the numbers, especially with the overhead with these strongman guys, just seem crazy to me. I mean, again, especially by today's standards online, I'm nothing special at all. But when I think of my deadlift, I was able to hit a 500-pound deadlift right around there by the time I was about 20, and I was only 170 pounds. So I was pretty light, and I'm like the opposite of you. So I'm 6'1", I have a 6'4" arm span, just long legs, long arms. Whereas like my overhead press took me, I don't know, 15 years to hit a 225 overhead press. And like that for me was a big accomplishment. I'm not on all like the super supplements and stuff, but to say, when I hear about a 400-pound overhead press and that some of these other strongmen are doing this for reps, it's just mind boggling how strong some of these guys are.
Yeah, and leverages absolutely play a role. I mean, and I get a lot of shit because I've made comments about like sumo deadlifting and powerlifting. Like I've stirred up that beehive.
Mm.
I mean, just because there's a spirit of the sport, and it's like this in every sport. There's a spirit of the sport, and then there's what athletes try to get away with given however the rules happen to be. And then sports are always changing over time. So, anyways, coming from a sport where so much of the strength gets tested from having to actually bend over and pick something up, seeing the difference and kind of breaking down like mechanically what's happening and what it says about the lifter and so on, I do not absolve myself from that discussion whatsoever. And in fact, I would describe if there was such thing as a sumo overhead press, that would be me. And having very short arms, short upper arm has always made the lockout very quick and snappy. You always do the thing you're good at that you like to do.
Sure.
I've excelled very quickly just because I did it more than everything else. And I've trained guys I train a buddy of mine, Andrew Mock. He worked at the gym and actually ended up taking over the gym when I left. Very good strongman, competes as a middleweight, 6'3" or 4, which is not common for a middleweight competitor. And the guy has this huge wingspan. It's like, how do we get this guy to get anything over his head? And when you see how long the distance is, how far it has to travel, you're like, oh, this is a different thing. And the same arrangement of sets and reps might not work. The same prescription of effort and percentages might not work. The same list of a supplementary exercise might not work. And that's where you really have to take the brain cells you have, really rub them together to try to come up with a good solution, because it is different, from a demonstration of a feat, and also from, what's going on under the hood, so we can get under there and actually get the right answer.
Yeah, no, for sure. Now, I think when a lot of people think of strongman, they're thinking like the top guys, like, like Hafthor and like, Eddie Hall and all that. And so at that, I mean, these guys are like 400 pounds. So that's I assume like the highest like tier. Would you say that, we talked about the super supplements a little bit, is that kind of ubiquitous across all professional strongmen there, or is it just more and more at the high levels or higher weights, I should say?
Ooh, I got to speak carefully, because there's how I talk to the people that are in the field, and there's how I talk to everybody out there. So I got to choose my words carefully, because my inclination is to just say it's everywhere and kind of leave it at that. But that's not entirely true. At the upper levels, it absolutely is ubiquitous. I would even say at the lower levels in strongman, it's ubiquitous in the sense that so many people do it, but not in the sense that it's 100% or that it's even mandatory to do. You're not going to become a high-level strongman without it. And if you are, it's because you're competing in a field of guys who are enhanced and their genetics are 1 in 1,000, and you happen to have genetics that are 1 in 100,000.
Mm-hmm.
If you can compete at that level, it's because you were born 6'8". You can hold 400 pounds with relative ease, and you had the childhood and environmental development that was conducive to being really good at that without needing that. That's extraordinarily rare. So yeah, at the top level, you're not going to see that at all whatsoever. But once you get down into the amateur ranks, and I would say even because they're newer, the weight classes, as you kind of trickle down, there's more pockets of people that aren't on anything, but it's almost like so many people are that it's not really worth talking about.
Yeah.
And it's shocking too, because it's not just like, well, the guys, first through 10 are on and then everybody else is off. There's a lot of really crappy athletes out there that are on just an insane amount of drugs.
Really?
And that's why the discussion is important to have, because how you frame expectations versus what people should be willing to do, it's such a complicated discussion. But there's a lot of people that get in, they're like, I love strongman, I want to be the world's strongest man, and they have a 200-pound deadlift. The next thing you know, it's been 5 years, they've gone through thousands of dollars worth of test and trend, and they're no better for it. So stacking priorities is really important. Understanding what you could potentially do given your set of tools is really important. It's a big discussion.
Yeah, I would almost wonder if it's got to be a higher, I mean, maybe not compared to, let's say, top Mr. Olympia bodybuilders, but just on average more than bodybuilding, because with strongman and powerlifting, I mean, but really, I feel like even more strongman, it's like the heaviest guys in the world, like the biggest, strongest people out there. And whereas like with bodybuilding, I mean, I can think of a number of even professional bodybuilders who they're on either low doses or the natural, but there's so much to be said for the shape of the muscle bellies, the insertions, the aesthetics, the posing, that you could be 185 pounds and just look super freaky. Whereas with strongman, it's just like your actual strength there, you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it can go a couple of ways with body. I have a really good friend who's the best man at my wedding. Shout out to Russ, who's he's a bodybuilder. He lives and breathes bodybuilding, and I went to one of his shows. And on the one hand, you're right, because some of the things that are required to be a good bodybuilder have little to nothing to do with the drugs. So when you're talking about the shape and basically you have to be a muscle protein synthesizing machine, regardless of the gear use. The gear doesn't take somebody who can't grow a full muscle belly and suddenly have them look like Mike O'Hearn. But it does obviously enhance whatever you have. So there are, I think, things that are required and you could do potentially pretty well, especially at the lower and mid-tier levels. There's rumors of guys like, Kai Green and Ronnie Coleman. When you see their pictures where they were supposedly natural,
Right.
it's kind of believable when you count the size discrepancy at that point in their career where they were freaks. So later on where it's like, holy shit, where did that come from? It's like Ronnie Coleman was what, 215, and he looked better than anybody else. And then he's 285 on stage so many years later. And it's like, okay, that gives you some insight. But and again, those guys are, one in a million. On the other hand, and this is some of the insight I got from my buddy, when you're trying to compete nowadays on any serious level, the things like striations and graininess and being adequately dehydrated while also looking full are no longer optional. There isn't a package you can bring that doesn't feature that isn't going to that isn't going to hurt you in the long run. And that's only really gotten with a big mix of diuretics and a lot of other shit on top of it. And that's ultimately why so many people are dying in that field. But I understand your point as far as the different dynamics of bodybuilding.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, no question. At the high levels of bodybuilding, it's extremely rampant. And you also have other things that strongmen would never take, right? I mean, I don't know, but I would guess strongmen are not as focused on maybe insulin. Well, I guess they still would be because you're trying to shut up, but probably not SEO. You probably don't have site enhancement in strongman and things like that. Obviously, well, I don't want to say obviously, probably not diuretics other than maybe to weigh in. I would assume those things are not as rampant.
No, yeah. And the diuretics aren't, when they are used, they're not abused as much because, it's temporary. It's literally just to get your body weight. It's not to get a certain look. And they don't get it's still a bad idea if you're cutting weight. If you can't cut, if you're a middleweight competitor and you can't cut 20, 25 pounds on your own, then there's a problem with your protocol. Diuretics are super easy, but it can go sideways so fast. It's like, why? As far as the other stuff, I know some people who have abused insulin. So the guys, it's unfortunate. It attracts a lot of personality types, and I think every sport is at the upper echelon where it's the monsters. It's the people that will do everything and they want everything, and they make an agreement with themselves right at the start where it's going to be all gas, no brakes. And I'm actually pretty surprised that you don't hear more about health issues from that side of things, because I know some idiots out there.
Yeah, you definitely hear it a lot, especially in the last few years with bodybuilding, but I don't, maybe it's just because it's not as popular, but I don't hear about it so much in like powerlifting and strongman. But yeah, it's funny, like you get like some people where I think most men, like when they watch like some of these like strongman stuff, or like I really like watching MMA, you see that and you're like, oh, that's really cool, and like I would want to do that. And you realize that the people who take it to that level, like there's something mentally that's just different, right? And I think there was like a story with Mike Tyson, and his son wanted to be a boxer, and then he just like laughed in his face. He's like, man, you go to private school, like you're not going to be a boxer.
I love hearing how the guys we knew growing up that were hard, that came from rough backgrounds, like athletes that came from rough areas, rappers that came from absolutely nothing and made their name. You have like guys like Snoop Dogg will make a joke about how his kids are spoiled. It's like, I came from here, you came from here. And it's funny because getting into these niches, anybody can fight, anybody can lift weights or exercise, but there is that disconnect from seeing the nth degree, seeing the most extreme, the hardest, the baddest, the most out there, and thinking that because that's something you would like to do, well, obviously I just got to go down to the store and pick up a badass card, and then I just got to go over here and I got to get my outfit, and then I got to go over here
Right.
and sign up for a meet, and then before you know it, like I'm going to be world's strongest man in no time. There is, and it's a problem I think with social media that's getting worse. There's a big disconnect where people think that it is that easy, or at least that it should be that easy. That I guess not really being around, seeing it from afar lets you draw these bad conclusions about what it takes to get there, and compare that with what you're willing to do on a day-to-day basis. But also that removes all the really good, cool shit that you can do if you actually prioritize it. If you understand that there's still really good reasons for everybody to lift weights, and you don't have to have this idea that you're going to go out and be the next big thing, because 999 out of 1,000 are not.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
still want as many people lifting as possible, so they're not bedridden so early, so their bone density stays high. A population that squats is just a better population. You're going to have a stronger populace. They're going to be more useful. They're going to live longer. They're going to be happy. There's so many good things, and that applies to every sport. So many good things to be gotten out of it. But there really is a fixation now that it's that's replaced pop culture. So that's what social media is. So that's where everybody focuses, and that's all they want to do. And they see that, and if they associate, if I want to get into this, and any gym owner, I'm sure you've talked to enough people over the years, will tell you, it's like if you own a CrossFit gym, kids come in and they're like, I want to be the next CrossFit Games world champ. If you own an MMA gym, somebody comes in and they're like, I want to be the next UFC champ. In my gym, I had not one, I had multiple people come in say, I want to set a record in X lift.
Mm.
And my question was, how long have you been lifting? And they were all under a year.
Yeah.
So just trying to bridge that, get people oriented right, I think is another important thing.
It's tough because you don't want to kill, this is something I talk about on my channel a lot, is you don't want to kill people's motivation. And if you don't try, you don't know how far you're going to take it. And I think a lot of us have, somebody I talked to said, like, if I knew I was only going to get to like X point or whatever like natural potential was, I might have not even started if I knew, because it's almost disheartening if you think, like, my goal when I started was to be 220 at 10% body fat. And I'm literally like 20 pounds shy of that. And it's like, I just, and I'm not saying no natural it could get to that point, but I would say there's not that many 220-pound lean naturals out there. I mean, again, it exists. I'm just saying on average. And I think if you see, what's that?
It's a lofty goal, right? That you're a big dude if you're 220 and 10% body fat.
Right. And you see that though, but it's like, that's what got me into it. If I thought I was just going to be less lanky, then maybe it wouldn't have been like this thing that I spent so much time for. And I think there's a lot of people who have accomplished a lot because they thought they were going to get even further. So where do you go with that? I mean, I remember seeing it, for whatever reason, this comment stands out in my mind, was like comment section of Mike O'Hearn, and some, again, person admitted he'd only been lifting for about a year. And he was so sure Mike O'Hearn was natural because, look, he's been lifting for 20 years. And like, I'm going to be there some way too. And I'm going to be laughing at I'm obviously not going to argue with this guy who's been lifting for like 6 months about it, but it's just to say a lot of people think they could be the next UFC champ, the next Mr. Olympia, and they just genuinely don't understand the insane amount of work that goes into it, the insane amount of genetic draw that goes into that. I mean, there's so many factors.
Yeah, and I struggle with finding a hardline principle with that, because there's a couple different components that kind of conflict. Like, on the one hand, it's almost, you would say, disrespectful to the sport when you talk about it so flippantly, because I always relate this stuff back to consumerist culture. This is a consumer-driven sport, and I think a lot of people don't really pay attention to or hold in their head what is different between something like the NFL or the UFC and what we do. They're both great. They're both sports. They're both physical activity, but one is propped up by advertising revenue and the money that gets dumped in from fans who watch because you can get eyeballs on it. It's a viewer sport. So the cream of the crop sits at the top, and everybody else that participates is at the bottom trying to get to that point. And they are what prop up the sport. In powerlifting and strongman, it's a consumer-driven sport. The sport is the amateur class. The sport is the kind of intermediate class. That's where all the money comes from, people paying to participate as opposed to watching and viewing. And that really skews how people how people see these activities they get into. And there is this weird kind of consumerist entitlement, I guess, or at the very least, a dismissiveness that comes from not actually, I don't want to say having your ass kicked, but I'm having your ass kicked in the sense of grinding against something and actually seeing how hard it is. The UFC thing is the best example because most men grossly overestimate their capabilities in a fight. Right?
Yeah.
I know what it's like to get tied up by somebody half my size. Same thing with arm wrestling. If somebody who is 140 pounds walks into a bar and looks up at me and says, "Hey, bro, do you arm wrestle?" I'm like, "Nope, I sure don't," because I'm not going to get my arm broken by the guy that has the hand of steel. So there's a really different thing there. But on the other hand, I have benefited greatly from what I would call unearned optimism in my early years, because I did have some big goals, some big proclamations when I was all full of, those 16-year-old hormones. I thought I was going to go run over the world. And that did pick up some momentum that I think got me farther than it would have otherwise. So I don't know how to dose that properly in the general population, except to just, try to gas people up on one hand and tell them to be a little humble on the other.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I actually plan a future podcast I have coming up where that's going to be a main topic of discussion, because it's really a fine line. And it's like when you're talking to thousands of people, or in your case on your channel, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of people, you want to give out the right message, and you don't want to dissuade people. It's tough. It's like, do you be fully honest and blunt, or you break dreams? It is tough for sure.
Yeah, and I desperately want to have a code that I could write down, and I just don't have one. In practice, I mean, I can speak carefully right now. The truth is, in practice, for better, for worse, and it might even be for worse, might be something I need to reevaluate. But I think I end up coming down on the side of not really catering to people whose presence in the field might be fragile.